A mess? Vance's voice rose, the control finally beginning to crack. She is a child, Mom. She is 8 years old. She spilled juice. My name is Loretta. I am 38 years old, and I came home to find my 8-year-old daughter being forced to scrub floors by my in-laws while they took their real granddaughter to an amusement park. Before I tell you what happened next, and how one single sentence at a fancy restaurant blew up their entire world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. It all started when my work trip ended 2 days early. I had been out of state for a major corporate conference. I was exhausting myself, working 14-hour days, attending endless seminars, and sitting through marathon meetings. I was fighting hard for a major promotion at my company. It was the kind of promotion that came with a significant salary increase, the kind of money that would allow me to finally set up a massive college fund for my little girl. The pressure was intense, but when the final negotiations wrapped up ahead of schedule, a wave of pure relief washed over me. I managed to switch my flight and head back home early. I was so excited to surprise my husband, Vance, and especially my daughter, Opal. The flight back was turbulent, but I barely noticed. I spent the entire 3 hours looking out the window at the clouds, imagining the look on Opal's face when I walked through the door. I had bought her a little snow globe from the airport gift shop. It was nothing expensive, but she collected them, and I knew she would love it. I took a taxi from the airport because I did not want to ruin the surprise by asking Vance to come pick me up. The drive through our neighborhood felt like it took hours. The sun was shining, the lawns were green, and everything looked completely normal. I paid the driver, grabbed my suitcase from the trunk, and rolled it up our driveway. The wheels made a loud, rhythmic clacking sound against the concrete. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, stepping into the foyer. I walked through the front door expecting to hear the television blaring her favorite cartoon, or Opal's bright, ringing laughter echoing from the living room. I had this entire scene pictured in my head. I would drop my bags, she would come running around the corner, and I would scoop her up into a huge hug. Instead, there was just silence. It was a strange, heavy silence that felt thick and suffocating. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of quiet that makes the hairs on the back of your arms stand up. I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the brass doorknob. The silence was punctuated by a faint, rhythmic scrubbing sound, and the sharp, burning chemical smell of heavy-duty cleaning products. The smell was so strong it actually stung the inside of my nose. It smelled like industrial bleach and synthetic lemon. My blood ran cold. I left my suitcase right there in the entryway. I did not even take off my coat. I followed the sound, my footsteps muffled by the hallway runner rug. I moved slowly, almost afraid of what I was going to find. I turned the corner into the kitchen, and there she was. My sweet, innocent, 8-year-old daughter was on her hands and knees. She was wearing a faded pink t-shirt and her little denim shorts. In her hands, she held a giant, abrasive yellow sponge. Her tiny hands were completely raw and bright red from the harsh chemicals and the friction. The skin around her knuckles looked irritated and angry. Tears were silently streaming down her face, dropping one by one onto the floor as she scrubbed frantically at a spot on the linoleum that was already perfectly clean. The floor was practically shining, but she just kept moving that sponge in tight, desperate circles. She was breathing heavily, her small shoulders shaking with every movement. She did not even look up when I walked into the room. She was so completely focused, so terrified, that she did not hear me approach. I did not yell. I did not scream for my husband. I did not cry out in horror. I simply stood there, frozen in the doorway. A strange, icy calm washed over my entire body. It started in my chest and radiated out to my fingertips. It was the kind of calm you feel in the moments right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. It was not a peaceful calm, it was the total suspension of all normal emotion, replaced by a pure, terrifying clarity. I walked across the kitchen floor. My shoes made soft tapping noises against the shiny linoleum. I knelt down right beside her. I could hear her ragged, hitched breathing. I gently reached out and took the harsh yellow sponge from her trembling hand. I tossed it into the stainless steel sink. The wet sponge hit the metal with a heavy thud. Then, I reached out and pulled her small, fragile body into my arms. The moment she felt my touch, the moment she realized it was me, she just collapsed against my chest. All the tension left her muscles at once. Her little body was trembling violently with quiet, agonizing sobs. She gripped the fabric of my coat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She buried her wet face into my shoulder, hiding from the world. "Sweetheart, where is Grandma? Where is Grandpa?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I stroked her hair, trying to untangle the messy knots at the back of her head. I kept my voice perfectly level, hiding the absolute rage that was beginning to boil just beneath the surface of my icy exterior. She pressed her face deeper into my shoulder. They went to the park," she mumbled, her voice muffled by my coat. "With Blythe. Blythe is Vance's niece. She is the biological daughter of Vance's older sister. Why did they not take you?" I asked, rubbing her back in slow, soothing circles. Her next words felt like a physical punch straight to my gut. I actually felt the breath leave my lungs. "Grandma said, she said I had to be punished for spilling my juice," Opal whispered, her voice cracking. She pulled back just enough to look at me with her big, tear-filled brown eyes. "She said I needed to learn my place. I needed to learn my place, Mommy." The dam of my composure finally broke right then and there, but no sound came out of my mouth. The sheer cruelty of those words from an adult to a child paralyzed me. I closed my eyes tightly, forcing back the burning tears that threatened to fall. I just held her tighter, pulling her back against my chest, and I rocked her back and forth on the cold kitchen floor. We sat there for a long time. The refrigerator hummed in the background. The clock on the wall ticked. I rocked her, over and over, trying to absorb some of her pain. This behavior from my in-laws was not new. Not really. There had always been a divide. It was just the loudest, the most blatant, and the cruelest it had ever been. We adopted Opal when she was just a tiny baby. The adoption process had been long and emotionally draining. We had to hire a specialized family lawyer to navigate the complex system and ensure we secured full, irrevocable legal custody. It was the hardest thing we ever did, but the day the judge slammed the gavel and declared her legally ours was the best day of my life. She is my daughter. She is Vance's daughter. He legally adopted her. She is our entire world, the absolute center of our universe. But to his parents, Francine and Harlan, Opal was always just an add-on. A footnote in the family tree. They never treated her with the same warmth they reserved for their biological grandchildren. I remember last Christmas so vividly. The whole family had gathered at Francine and Harlan's large, overly decorated house. The living room looked like a magazine cover, with a massive tree covered in expensive glass ornaments. It was time to open presents. Blythe, my niece, tore into a massive box wrapped in shiny gold paper. Inside was a spectacular, 3-story wooden dollhouse that took up half the living room floor. It had working lights, miniature furniture, and must have cost at least $500. Blythe shrieked with joy. Then it was Opal's turn. Francine handed her a flat, poorly wrapped box. Opal opened it carefully, a hopeful smile on her face. Inside was a scratchy, dull brown sweater. It was clearly pulled from a clearance rack, and it still had the wrinkly, bright red sales sticker stuck right on the collar tag. It was 2 sizes too big. Opal smiled politely and said thank you, because we raised her to be grateful, but I saw the confusion in her eyes. At the time, on the drive home, Vance just gripped the steering wheel, sighed heavily, and said, "You know my parents, Loretta. They are just a little old-fashioned." I had let it slide. I had kept the peace. I had bitten my tongue to avoid causing a massive family rift. But looking at my daughter shivering on the kitchen floor, smelling like bleach, I realized my silence had been a terrible mistake. This was not old-fashioned. This was abuse. Pure, calculated emotional abuse. I stood up, my joints popping a little from the cold floor. I scooped Opal up into my arms. She was getting tall, but she felt incredibly light in that moment. I carried her down the hallway to the bathroom. I sat her on the edge of the porcelain bathtub. I turned on the warm water at the sink and grabbed a soft, plush white towel. I gently washed her hands, using a mild, unscented soap to get the harsh chemicals off her raw skin. She flinched a little when the water hit her knuckles. I dried her hands carefully, patting the skin instead of rubbing. I opened the medicine cabinet and took out the first aid kit. I found a tube of healing ointment and dabbed it onto the raw, red spots on her knuckles. I placed small, colorful bandages over the worst areas. "There we go," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "All clean." I took her by the hand and walked her into the living room. I pulled the heavy curtains closed, shutting out the bright afternoon sun. I grabbed her favorite, fluffy fleece blanket from the back of the armchair. We sat together on the large sectional couch, wrapped tightly in the blanket. I went to the freezer and grabbed a massive tub of chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream and 2 spoons. I did not even bother with bowls. I just brought the tub to the couch, and we sat there, eating the cold, sweet ice cream straight from the cardboard container. As the sugar and the warmth of the blanket started to soothe her, she finally opened up. She told me everything. She told me how, for the last 3 days while I was at my conference, Francine and Harlan had come over to help out while Vance was at the office. But instead of helping, they had systematically isolated her. She told me how she had been left completely alone in the house while they took Blythe out for special treats, to the bakery, and to the toy store. She told me how Francine handed her a list of heavy chores to do, sweeping the garage, wiping down baseboards, scrubbing the kitchen, while Blythe was allowed to sit on the plush living room rug and watch her favorite cartoons on the big screen television. Then, she told me about that morning. She had accidentally bumped her elbow against her glass of apple juice at the breakfast table. It spilled onto the placemat. It was a normal accident. Any child would do it. But Francine had lost her mind. Opal told me how Francine had loomed over her, looked her right in the eyes, and said, "It is a shame, but blood is thicker than water." I stopped eating. The spoon felt heavy in my hand. I stared at the blank television screen across the room. Every muscle in my jaw was locked tight. The rage I felt was no longer hot and fiery. It was absolute, freezing zero. When Vance got home from his corporate office an hour later, I heard his car pull into the driveway. I heard the engine turn off. I heard his heavy leather shoes walking up the front steps. The front door opened with a familiar click. "Loretta? Opal? I am home," he called out cheerfully, dropping his briefcase by the door. He walked into the living room, loosening his silk tie. The moment he stepped into the room, the color completely drained from his face. He stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the tub of ice cream. He looked at the heavy blanket. He saw Opal's bright red, bandaged hands gripping the spoon. He saw the dried tear tracks staining her pale cheeks. And then, he looked up and met my eyes. He did not need me to say a single word. The air in the room was so thick with tension you could cut it with a knife. I watched his face closely. I saw the immediate wave of crushing guilt hit him first, causing his shoulders to slump. But within seconds, that guilt was swallowed entirely by a white-hot, terrifying fury. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. His eyes darkened. For years, Vance had been the peacekeeper. He had been downplaying his parents' toxic behavior for years. He was always making excuses for them, always telling me to look the other way, always trying to manage their difficult personalities. He loved his parents, and he wanted to believe they were good people. But looking at his traumatized daughter, realizing what had happened under his own roof, the illusion shattered. There were no more excuses left. The well had run completely dry. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my trip was. He walked slowly across the living room carpet. He dropped to his knees right in front of the couch, bringing himself down to Opal's eye level. He reached out with shaking hands and gently touched her bandaged knuckles. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with heavy, raw emotion. It cracked on the first syllable. "I am so sorry, sweetie," he said, his voice barely above a gravelly whisper. He reached forward and pulled her into a tight, desperate hug. He buried his face in her hair. I could see his broad shoulders shaking. "I did not protect you," he whispered into her ear, but loud enough for me to hear. "That will never, ever happen again." He pulled back and looked her directly in the eyes. His expression was fierce, harder than I had ever seen it. "I promise you, Opal. Nobody will ever treat you like this again in our home." It was not just a comforting promise to a child. It was a vow. A sacred, unbreakable vow. I set the ice cream tub down on the coffee table. I put my hand on Vance's shoulder. He reached up and covered my hand with his. We stayed like that for a few minutes, breathing in unison, bracing ourselves for the storm that was about to hit our shores. We knew they were coming back. A few hours later, the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the front lawn. We had moved to the kitchen. I was making a simple dinner of macaroni and cheese, trying to keep things normal for Opal. Vance was sitting at the island counter, staring blankly at the granite surface. Suddenly, the front door opened. The brass handle clicked loudly. In walked Francine and Harlan. They were laughing loudly about something they had just seen at the amusement park. I could hear the rustle of shopping bags and the clinking of keys. "We are back," Francine called out in her sing-song, perfectly pitched voice. Blythe had the most wonderful time on the carousel. "Harlan, put those bags in the hall closet, will you?" They strolled into the kitchen, entirely relaxed, entirely confident in their power over our household. But they stopped dead in their tracks when they saw me standing by the stove, and Vance sitting rigidly at the counter. The laughter died instantly in their throats. Francine recovered first. She smoothed down her expensive silk blouse. She plastered a fake, sugary smile on her face that did not quite reach her cold eyes. "Loretta. You are back early," Francine said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We did not expect you until Thursday." I slowly wiped my hands on a kitchen towel. I placed the towel deliberately on the counter. I stood up perfectly straight, pulling my shoulders back. "Where were you, Francine?" I asked. My voice was dangerously quiet. I did not raise my pitch. I did not shout. I spoke with the calm, flat tone of a judge reading a guilty verdict. Francine blinked, clearly taken aback by my tone. She tightened her grip on her designer handbag. We took Lily to the park," she said, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "She had a wonderful time. The weather was just too perfect to stay indoors. She was completely oblivious to the danger she was in. She truly believed she had done nothing wrong." Vance pushed his chair back from the island counter. The wood scraped loudly against the floor. He stood up, towering over his mother. He stepped directly in front of me, placing himself between me and his parents as a physical shield. "Why was Opal left here alone, scrubbing the floor?" Vance asked. His voice was incredibly low, vibrating with a tight, controlled anger. Francine actually scoffed. She rolled her eyes and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, Vance, please do not be so dramatic," Francine waved her hand dismissively. "We were simply teaching her a little responsibility. She made a terrible mess in the kitchen this morning. She spilled her sticky juice all over the good placemats." Vance took a step closer to his mother. "You left an 8-year-old home alone as a punishment. You made her scrub the floor with industrial bleach until her hands bled." Francine took a step back, her eyes widening. She looked at Harlan for support. That is when Harlan, who had been standing silently in the doorway observing the exchange, finally spoke up. But he did not try to calm the situation down in the way you would expect a father to do. He looked at Vance, not with apology, but with a deep, arrogant frustration. Harlan crossed his arms over his chest. "You do not understand the bigger picture here, Vance," he said condescendingly. "I am trying to protect this family's future." It was a completely bizarre thing to say. It made absolutely no sense in the context of punishing a child for spilling juice. The sentence just hung heavily in the air for a second, confusing both Vance and me. Protect the family's future? What did making a little girl scrub a floor have to do with the future? Francine, sensing that the dynamic in the room was shifting rapidly and that she was losing her iron grip of control over her son, decided to go for the jugular. She bypassed Vance completely. She looked right past his shoulder, locking her cold, hard eyes directly onto mine. She lifted her chin, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure spite. She said the exact words that would permanently seal her fate. "Frankly, Loretta," Francine sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Blood is thicker than water. She is not our real granddaughter. We have no obligation to treat her like she is." The silence that followed that statement was absolutely deafening. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. The only sound was the faint bubbling of the water boiling on the stove behind me. Vance slowly turned his head. He looked at his mother as if he had never seen her before in his entire life. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The last remaining thread of family loyalty, of dutiful obligation to his parents, just snapped. I could almost hear the sound of it breaking in his mind. He was the one who spoke first. "You have chosen your blood," Vance said. His voice was shaking violently, a raw mixture of uncontainable rage and profound heartbreak. "You made your choice very clear." He pointed a shaking finger toward the front door. "Now, we are choosing our family," he declared, his volume rising to a shout. "I want you to go upstairs, pack whatever things you left in the guest room, and I want you to get out of my house. Now." Francine gasped, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror. "Vance. You cannot speak to your mother this way. We are your parents. Get out." Vance roared, the sound echoing off the kitchen tiles. I stepped up and stood firmly by his side. I put my hand flat against the middle of his back, offering my silent, unwavering support. I looked at Francine and Harlan, and I just nodded once. We were a united front. We were a team, and we were done playing their twisted games. The two of them stood there in the entryway, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly like fish out of water. They were utterly shocked, completely paralyzed by the realization that their power over Vance had just evaporated into thin air. They had pushed him too far, and the bridge was finally burned to ash. Without another word, Harlan grabbed Francine by the elbow. They turned around, walked out the front door, and slammed it shut behind them. The house shook with the force of it. We stood in the kitchen, breathing hard. The silence returned, but this time it was not heavy or terrifying. It was the silence of a house that had just been cleansed. Vance turned to me, tears shining in his eyes, and pulled me into a fierce embrace. We had survived the first battle, but we knew the war was far from over. The next morning, the sun rose over our quiet suburban street just like any other day. But inside our house, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. And exactly as I knew it would happen, my cell phone started ringing off the hook. It started at 7 in the morning. A shrill, annoying ringtone breaking the morning calm. I looked at the screen. It was Vance's Aunt Beatrice. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, Vance's phone buzzed aggressively on the bedside table. It was his cousin, Gregory. Vance stared at the screen, his jaw tight, and hit the ignore button. The phone calls kept coming. They did not stop. Aunts, uncles, second cousins, people we barely spoke to outside of major holidays, all of them calling in a coordinated attack. They left lengthy, dramatic voicemails to tell us how incredibly ungrateful, disrespectful, and cruel we were being. It was obvious what had happened. Francine had not slept. She had been busy all night, spinning her incredibly creative, highly fictionalized tale. She had painted a masterpiece of manipulation. In her version of events, she was the victimized, loving grandmother who was just trying to help out. She framed me as the overly sensitive, hysterical daughter-in-law who overreacted to a simple chore, and Vance as the brainwashed, ungrateful son who had viciously thrown his loving parents out onto the cold street without a second thought. By noon, the pressure was immense. The sheer volume of incoming hostility was staggering. Vance was pacing the length of the living room rug, running his hands through his hair. He looked torn apart, the stress etching deep lines into his face. He paused by the window, looking out at the street. "They are my parents, Loretta," he said, his voice cracking with a mixture of betrayal and confusion. "I know them. I know they can be difficult. But how could they do this to a child? To our child? To Opal?" I walked over to the window. I stood in front of him and wrapped my arms around his waist. I held him tightly, anchoring him to reality. "We are in this together," I reminded him softly, looking up into his eyes. "I promised you. We are a team. We will handle them. We will not let them win this narrative." Vance sighed, resting his chin on the top of my head. We stood there for a few minutes, just breathing. It was during that quiet, grounded conversation by the window that Vance casually mentioned a detail. It was a small, seemingly insignificant comment, but it was the spark that made the gears in my head start to turn with rapid, alarming speed. "It is just so weird," Vance muttered, shaking his head. "For the last month, Dad has been acting so strangely. He has been constantly calling me, constantly asking about your new project at work. The Genesis project." I pulled back slightly, looking at him with sudden focus. "He was asking about Genesis?" Vance nodded. "Yeah. Constantly. Asking about the timelines, the budget approvals, who the primary contractors were. He seemed almost desperate for details. And right there, standing in the middle of my living room, every scattered puzzle piece violently clicked into place. The fog lifted, revealing the ugly, calculated machinery operating behind my in-laws' actions. The Genesis project was not just a regular assignment. It was my baby. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar, company-wide initiative that I had spent the last 2 years developing from the ground up. I was the lead director on it. It was the exact project that was positioning me for the huge promotion and the massive salary increase I had been fighting for. And Harlan, my father-in-law, owned a mid-sized, struggling commercial construction company. I knew from passing conversations at family dinners that his business had been taking a hit lately. Suddenly, a cold realization washed over me. Harlan's small construction company was one of dozens of local firms that had formally submitted a bid for a highly lucrative subcontracting position on the Genesis project. We are talking about a $2.5 million contract. It was the kind of contract that could save a dying company or secure a very comfortable retirement. I thought back to the horrific confrontation in the kitchen. I heard Harlan's arrogant, confusing voice echoing in my memory. "I am trying to protect this family's future." That line suddenly made a horrifying, sickening kind of sense. He was not just being randomly cruel to my daughter. He was not just backing up his wife's toxic behavior. He was putting on a show of authority. He was trying to assert dominance over our household, while simultaneously trying to curry favor with me in his own twisted, manipulative, deeply patriarchal way. He thought that if he aligned with Francine to put Opal in her place, he was demonstrating traditional family values. He thought he could bully us into submission, and then turn around and use his status as the patriarch to secure that $2.5 million contract from my desk. He needed me. He was desperate for my influence on the Genesis project board. I let go of Vance and walked quickly over to the kitchen counter where I had tossed my purse. I pulled out my phone and opened my digital work calendar. I scrolled through the week's events. My eyes locked onto the entry for that very evening. There it was. Tonight. 7 o'clock. A formal, invite-only dinner for potential project partners and key stakeholders for the Genesis project. The host of the dinner was my boss, the CEO of our corporation, Mr. Desmond. And because Harlan's company had made it past the initial screening phase of the bidding process, Harlan and Francine would absolutely be on the guest list. They would be there, dressed to the nines, ready to network, shake hands, and schmooze with the executives. They were probably banking on using their relationship with me to secure the deal. I felt a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. The icy calm from yesterday returned, but this time it was forged with absolute purpose. I turned back to Vance. I held up my phone, showing him the calendar screen. "We are going to that dinner tonight," I told Vance, a fully formed, devastating plan assembling itself in my mind. "And we are going together." Vance looked at the calendar, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Loretta, are you sure? After everything that just happened? We are exhausted. The phone will not stop ringing. They are going to be there. Do you really want to face them in public right now?" I walked over to him. I reached out and cupped his face in my hands. "Vance, listen to me," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "We are not going to hide in our house while they destroy our reputation to your family. We are not going to let them control the narrative anymore. We are not going to play the victims." I looked deep into his eyes. "We are just going to go to that dinner, and we are going to be exactly who we are. We are going to be professionals. We are going to protect our family." Vance stared at me for a long moment. He saw the fire, the absolute, unshakable resolve burning in my eyes. The exhaustion in his posture slowly faded, replaced by a rigid determination. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. He nodded his head. "Okay," Vance said, his voice firm. "Let me go upstairs and get my dark suit out of the closet. We have a dinner to attend." Gemini said. I walked slowly up the hardwood stairs to our master bedroom. My legs felt incredibly heavy, but my mind was racing with absolute clarity. I walked into my large walk-in closet and stared at the long rows of hanging clothes. I did not just need a nice outfit for a corporate networking dinner. I needed armor. I reached out and selected a sharply tailored, dark navy blue suit. It was the exact same suit I had worn when I successfully negotiated my massive corporate salary increase last year. I took it off the heavy wooden hanger. The expensive fabric felt cool and smooth against my fingers. I walked into the master bathroom and flipped on the bright vanity lights. I leaned over the marble sink and stared directly into my own reflection. I had faint, dark circles under my eyes from the exhausting travel and the emotional trauma of the afternoon, but my eyes themselves were burning with a fierce, protective fire. I opened my cosmetic drawer. I carefully applied my foundation to smooth out my complexion. I applied 2 coats of dark black mascara. I pulled my hair back tightly and pinned it into a sleek, severe bun at the nape of my neck. I did not want a single strand of hair out of place tonight. I wanted to look like a woman who was in absolute, unquestionable control of her life and her career. Vance walked into the bathroom a few minutes later. He was carrying his dark charcoal suit. He dressed in complete silence. He buttoned his crisp white dress shirt and stood in front of the mirror to tie his silk tie. I watched his reflection. His large hands were shaking very slightly. I stepped up behind him. I reached around his waist, placed my hands over his, and helped him adjust the knot of the tie until it was perfectly straight. Our eyes met in the reflection of the mirror. We did not need to exchange a single word. We both knew exactly what was about to happen. We were preparing for battle. We obviously could not leave Opal alone at the house, and we certainly were not going to call a family member to watch her. I picked up my phone and called our next-door neighbor, Sarah. Sarah is a wonderful, retired school teacher who adores Opal. Sarah walked over to our house within 10 minutes. She brought a new, colorful jigsaw puzzle to put together on the living room rug. I knelt down by the front door, wrapped my arms around Opal, and kissed her gently on the forehead. I promised her that we would be back very soon and that Sarah would make her hot chocolate. Vance and I walked out into the cool evening air. The sun had completely set, leaving the neighborhood in shadows. Vance unlocked the sedan, and we got inside. The leather seats felt stiff and cold. Vance started the engine, put the car in reverse, and backed slowly out of our long driveway. We drove through the dark, quiet streets of our suburban neighborhood in silence. The yellow glow of the streetlights passed overhead in a rhythmic, flashing pattern. The atmosphere inside the car was incredibly heavy. Vance gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. "It is just so insane," Vance finally said, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the dark road ahead of us. "My parents act as if they are protecting some massive, royal inheritance. They treat this entire family like it is nothing more than a cold business transaction. Honestly, Loretta, if we ever even whispered the word divorce, my mother would treat it like an absolute tragedy, but only because of how it would look to her friends. She treats our family dynamics like she is planning a funeral arrangement. It is all completely about outward appearances and social status." I nodded my head slowly, looking out the passenger side window at the passing headlights of other cars. "Well," I said softly, my voice calm and even, "tonight, her perfect public appearances are going to crack wide open." We drove downtown and pulled up to the grand, brightly lit entrance of the restaurant. It was a highly exclusive, high-end steakhouse that our corporation often used for major networking events. The valet approached quickly and opened my door. I stepped out onto the pristine pavement and adjusted the lapels of my navy blue jacket. Vance handed our electronic car keys to the valet driver, and we walked together through the heavy, oversized glass double doors. The hostess greeted us warmly and directed us toward the private event space. The restaurant was exactly what you would expect for a multi-million-dollar corporate gathering. The lighting was set low, casting a warm, amber glow over the room. There were thick, dark mahogany tables spaced perfectly apart. The air smelled heavenly, a rich mixture of expensive roasted meats, garlic butter, and very old red wine. I could hear the constant, musical clinking of crystal water glasses. I could hear the low, steady, confident hum of important corporate conversations happening all around me. We checked our coats at the front desk and walked purposefully into the main dining room. I stood near the entrance and slowly scanned the large, crowded room. It did not take me very long to find our targets. Across the dining room, standing very close to the massive stone fireplace, were Francine and Harlan. Francine was wearing a bright, ostentatious emerald green dress. It was far too loud and far too formal for a corporate dinner, but she always needed to be the absolute center of attention. She was holding a tall glass of white wine, chatting animatedly with another vendor. Harlan was wearing a stiff, outdated black suit. He was hovering nervously, shifting his weight from foot to foot, near the large center table. That was the main table where Mr. Desmond, my chief executive officer, was currently sitting. Harlan was pacing slightly in a small circle. He looked exactly like a starving vulture waiting patiently for a scrap of meat to fall from the table. He was desperate. He was completely desperate for that $2.5 million contract. He was desperate to get his hands on a piece of my Genesis project to save his failing business. I felt a sudden, hot flash of pure anger crawl rapidly up the back of my neck. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second and took a very deep, stabilizing breath. I pushed the fiery anger down into the pit of my stomach. I could not afford to be emotional right now. I needed an absolutely clear, tactical head. Vance placed his large, warm hand flat against the small of my back, guiding me gently forward. We walked gracefully over to our assigned table and took our seats. The waiter immediately approached and poured us tall glasses of sparkling water with lemon. I kept my posture perfectly straight, but I watched Harlan and Francine closely from the corner of my eye. After about 20 minutes of dinner service, Mr. Desmond stood up from the center table. He began making his standard rounds around the room to personally greet his executives and the potential business partners. Mr. Desmond is a tall, imposing man with thick silver hair and an incredibly sharp, analytical mind. He built the company from the ground up, and he strictly demands excellence, loyalty, and unwavering integrity from every single person on his payroll. As Mr. Desmond slowly approached our section of the dining room, Francine finally made her calculated move. She quickly set her wine glass down on a passing waiter's silver tray. She grabbed Harlan by the sleeve of his dark suit and pulled him forward. She steered him directly toward our table, timing her aggressive walking pace perfectly so that they would intercept Mr. Desmond at the exact moment he reached Vance and me. Francine sauntered over to our table. She had a massive, fake, sugary smile plastered aggressively across her face. But underneath the expensive makeup, her eyes were hard, cold, and highly calculating. Mr. Desmond stopped at our table and smiled. "Loretta, Vance, it is truly wonderful to see you both this evening," he said, offering a warm, genuine nod. "Loretta, the preliminary numbers for the Genesis project presentation are looking absolutely phenomenal. Outstanding work." Before I could even open my mouth to say thank you to my boss, Francine forcibly inserted herself into our small circle. She stepped right past Vance and stood awkwardly close to Mr. Desmond. "Oh, Mr. Desmond," Francine chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial, cloying sweetness. "We are just so incredibly proud of our dear Loretta. It is simply wonderful that she is so highly successful in her demanding corporate career." Mr. Desmond looked slightly surprised by the sudden, overly familiar intrusion, but he remained polite and professional. "Yes, she is an absolutely vital asset to our executive team," he replied smoothly. Francine placed a manicured hand dramatically over her heart. She looked affectionately at me, and then turned her gaze back to Mr. Desmond, widening her eyes to look perfectly innocent. "And she somehow manages to do all of this hard work while being such a wonderful, patient mother to her little adopted girl," Francine said. She practically dragged the word adopted out, emphasizing it just enough to make Opal sound like a tragic, burdensome charity case instead of my actual daughter. She sighed dramatically. "Family is just the most important thing in the entire world, is it not, Mr. Desmond?" This was it. This was the exact moment of absolute truth I had been waiting for since I walked through my front door and smelled bleach. I looked up at Francine's incredibly smug, self-satisfied face. I looked over at Harlan's eager, greedy eyes darting back and forth between me and the chief executive officer. I did not flinch. I did not get emotional. I did not raise my voice in anger. I simply smiled right back at Francine. My smile was just as sweet as hers, but mine was entirely lethal. "Thank you so much, Francine," I said, my voice projecting perfectly clear and incredibly steady over the low hum of the restaurant. "You are absolutely right. Family truly is everything." I paused for a fraction of a second. I let the silence hang heavily in the air between us, drawing everyone's full attention to my next words. "And I firmly believe," I continued, "that the core values we hold dear in our private family lives, values like strict integrity, deep trust, and basic human decency, are the exact same ethical values we must relentlessly demand from our professional business partners." I slowly turned my head. I shifted my entire focus completely away from Francine and Harlan. I looked directly into the sharp, intelligent eyes of my chief executive officer. "Mr. Desmond," I said, my tone shifting instantly from polite daughter-in-law to my most authoritative, commanding professional voice. "Speaking of strict integrity, we have always agreed that ethical behavior is the absolute cornerstone of the Genesis project. We simply cannot compromise on the moral character of the people we choose to do business with." Mr. Desmond narrowed his eyes very slightly, immediately sensing the serious, heavy shift in my professional tone. He clasped his hands behind his back. "Go on, Loretta," he said quietly, giving me the floor. "Based on some highly disturbing new information that has very recently come to my direct personal attention regarding fundamental character, poor judgment, and highly unethical behavior, I said, enunciating every single syllable clearly so there could be no misunderstanding. I strongly believe we need to urgently conduct a much deeper, far more rigorous due diligence process on all of our potential subcontracting partners. I paused, pointing my gaze directly at Harlan. This specifically includes Mr. Wilson's construction company. We must ensure that every single vendor is fully and completely aligned with our strict corporate ethical values before we sign any financial contracts. If you've made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let's get back to my story. I did not raise my voice. I did not point any fingers. I did not throw a dramatic temper tantrum. I simply stated a grave, thoroughly professional concern directly to my superior in a public setting. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. A massive, freezing chill fell over our entire section of the dining room. Harlan, who had actually been stepping forward with his hand half raised to shake Mr. Desmond's hand, completely froze mid-step. His arm hung uselessly in the empty air. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking ashen, gray, and physically sick. Francine's fake, sugary smile shattered into a million invisible pieces. Her jaw literally dropped open in silent, uncomprehending horror. She stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. Mr. Desmond is a remarkably shrewd, highly perceptive corporate leader. He did not need me to explain the messy, dramatic family details in the middle of a steakhouse. He read the room instantly. He saw the panic on Harlan's face, and he understood the exact weight of my professional recommendation. He trusts my judgment completely. He looked at me and gave a slight, very serious nod of his head. An excellent point, Loretta, Mr. Desmond said, his voice carrying unquestionable authority and finality. Thank you for your rigorous diligence. We will absolutely pause that specific application immediately. Then, Mr. Desmond slowly turned his head. He looked right past my shoulder. His cold, calculating eyes landed directly on my father-in-law. Mr. Wilson, Mr. Desmond said. His voice was incredibly cool, polite, and utterly dismissive. Perhaps we will postpone our current business discussions indefinitely. Have a good evening. Mr. Desmond turned on his heel and calmly walked away to the next table, leaving Harlan completely stranded. It was not a loud, screaming explosion. No dishes were broken. No voices were raised. It was a silent, devastating, and absolute implosion of Harlan's greedy, desperate hopes, right there in the middle of a crowded room, entirely visible in front of his professional peers and competitors. The public humiliation was absolute and complete. Vance and I did not stay for dessert. We ate our main courses in quiet, highly satisfying peace, paid our tab, and then calmly walked to the front desk to retrieve our winter coats. We pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked out into the crisp, freezing night air. The valet driver saw us and jogged to bring our sedan around to the front. As Vance was pulling a cash tip out of his wallet for the valet driver, I heard the rapid, desperate, clicking sound of high heels aggressively hitting the concrete pavement behind us. Loretta. Vance. Wait. Stop. It was Harlan. He was jogging heavily toward us, his chest heaving, completely out of breath. Francine was trailing right behind him, struggling awkwardly to keep up in her tight green dress. Panic and sheer terror were etched deeply into every single line on Harlan's pale face. He looked 10 years older than he had when he was standing inside the restaurant just an hour ago. Vance, please, Harlan pleaded, his voice cracking loudly with sheer, undisguised desperation. He reached out a trembling hand toward my husband. You cannot do this to me. You have to go back in there and talk to her. You have to fix this. My company desperately needs that Genesis contract. We are facing total financial bankruptcy by the end of the quarter. You have to fix this right now. I stood silently by the open passenger car door. I wrapped my coat tighter around my shoulders. I let Vance handle this completely. Vance did not yell. He did not step forward to intimidate his father. He simply looked at the man who raised him, and the blazing anger from the kitchen was completely gone. It was entirely replaced by a kind of heavy, profound, and incredibly sad finality. "This was never about a business contract, Dad," Vance said. His voice was remarkably steady, deep, and grounded. "This was about my 8-year-old daughter. This was about Opal." Vance took one slow, deliberate step forward, forcing his father to nervously step backward. "You actively tried to use my wife for a lucrative business deal," Vance stated clearly, outlining the terrible truth. "While at the exact same time, my own mother was maliciously, emotionally abusing my little girl inside my own home. You genuinely thought you could break my family to save your failing business." Harlan opened his mouth to speak, desperately searching for an excuse, but no words came out. He just stood there, gasping for air. Francine finally caught up to them, but she did not say a word either. She just stared down at the concrete pavement, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. "You made your choice yesterday morning in our kitchen," Vance continued, his tone absolute and unwavering. "Now, we are making our choice. We are completely done. Do not ever call my phone again. Do not call my wife. And absolutely do not ever, under any circumstances, try to contact Opal. We have absolutely nothing left to say to either of you." Vance turned his back on his parents. He walked over to the passenger side of the vehicle. He held the heavy car door open for me. I stepped inside the warm, safe interior of the vehicle. Vance closed the door behind me with a solid, final, echoing thud. He walked around the front of the dark sedan, got into the driver's seat, and put the car in drive. We pulled smoothly out of the restaurant parking lot. We merged onto the quiet, empty highway leading back toward our suburb. We drove in silence, holding hands over the center console. We did not look back in the rearview mirror a single time. The 3 months that followed that night were incredibly quiet. It was a period of deep, necessary, and beautiful healing for our small family. We did not just blindly move on from the trauma and pretend it never happened. We actively put in the hard emotional work to rebuild our foundation from the ground up. We spent our weekends focusing entirely on Opal. We went to the local park and pushed her on the swings. We painted messy watercolor pictures on the dining room table. We baked batches of chocolate chip cookies in the kitchen, making sure to laugh when flour spilled on the floor instead of getting angry. Slowly, day by beautiful day, the bright, joyful light returned to her big brown eyes. The lingering fear faded away completely, replaced by the secure, solid knowledge that she was absolutely safe and unconditionally loved by her parents. One rainy Saturday afternoon, we were all sitting comfortably on the living room floor. We were surrounded by pieces of colorful construction paper, bright markers, and shiny glitter. We decided to create a special book together, just the three of us. We proudly named it the Wilson Family Charter. We filled the blank white pages with printed photographs from our favorite summer vacations, silly inside jokes that only the three of us understood, and colorful, messy stickers. Then, we sat together and wrote down our own specific, unbreakable rules for our household. Rule number 1, true love is what actually makes a family, not blood. Rule number 2, we will always listen to each other, and we will protect each other fiercely from anyone who tries to hurt us. Rule number 3, Friday night is always homemade pizza and movie night in the living room, with absolutely no exceptions allowed for any reason. I watched Opal laugh loudly as she grabbed a bright red marker. She leaned over the paper and carefully drew a massive, slightly lopsided red heart right next to rule number 1. Looking at her joyful, relaxed face, I knew deep in my soul that we had made the absolute right choice. Her natural confidence had begun to beautifully blossom once again. She was lighter. She was freer. She was a happy child again. Last week, I was sitting alone in the living room. It was very late at night, and the house was completely silent. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the pale, silvery moonlight stream brightly through the large front window. My gaze naturally fell on our brightly colored family charter, which now sits proudly and permanently on the center of the wooden coffee table. I used to genuinely think that family was simply something you were randomly born into. I thought it was a biological obligation that you were permanently stuck with, no matter how toxic, cruel, or damaging it became. I thought you had to endure the pain just to keep the peace. But sitting there in the quiet safety of my house, I finally knew that was a total lie. A true family is a mighty, impenetrable fortress. It is a secure fortress that you have to actively build yourself, brick by heavy brick, year by year. You have to carefully and intentionally choose every single person you allow to step foot inside those walls. And most importantly, it is a fortress you have to be completely willing to fiercely defend, standing your ground against any enemy, no matter what the ultimate cost may be. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. It was an incredibly painful and difficult journey to share with all of you, but I truly felt like I had to get it out into the world. My big question for all of you wonderful ladies watching is this: have you ever been forced to make the agonizing choice between the toxic family you were born into and the beautiful, chosen family you have built for yourself? Let me know your personal experiences and your stories down in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I love connecting with you all. And if my story resonated with your heart today, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one. It really does help me keep going and growing this amazing community. Take care of yourselves, love your true family, and always protect your peace.